Okay, let's take a look at this first group of writers here. First one, Gertrude Stein. The name might ring a bell. Very influential writer. She was born in the US but spent most of her time in France. Here's a statue of her. So in Paris, she hosted a salon with many influential artists. Henri Matisse, Picasso, Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, etc. And you can see here it's interesting, especially with her, how she connects art with literature, and which is really great, this overlap. And we can see in some of her works how she tried to imitate art on a literary terms. So she had different forms of writing. One was artistic and experimental. These works best illustrated in the modernist style, The Making of Americans. In this work, there's repetition, limited vocabulary, and extensive use of the present participle. So here's an excerpt. Let's just check out the way this is written. There are many that I know, and they know it. They are all of them repeating, and I hear it. I love it, and I tell it. I love it, and now I will write it. This is the story of the way some of them are it. So yeah, it's a lot of very different style of writing. It's simple, it's modernist, but it's just absolutely different than anything we've seen so far. Stein also had many accessible works, such as the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which is based on her own life partner. And she had an autobiographical work also. So when she connected painting to writing, she tried to equal the artistic movement of the time in words. These were called sketches. They don't follow any traditional narratological structure, but they're very interesting because it's her way of just kind of pointing at something and explaining about it. So they're kind of experimental and descriptive, okay? So they're descriptive of a single scene. We've got a single scene here. A movement or image. They're word portraits, no? Because they're kind of a form of lexical still life. And we can see these in Tender Buttons. Here's an example of that. This is from Objects. So a carafe, that is a blind glass, a kind of glass, and a cousin, a spectacle, and nothing strange, a single hurt color, and an arrangement in a system of pointing, all this and not ordinary, not unordered, in not resembling. The difference is spreading. So, very radical. Glazed glitter, nickel. What is a nickel? It is originally rid of a cover. The change is that the red weakens an hour, the change has come, etc., etc. And in these we can see how she is kind of giving each object a portrait, just like it's almost like it's painted in an abstract way, but she's putting that in words. Our next person here is Sherwood Anderson. Now, Sherwood Anderson was a novelist and writer of short stories. And here's a picture of him here. Stately fellow in his library. So he wrote Dark Laughter. It's the only bestseller of his lifetime, but it's a novel about sexual freedom in the 1920s. It was influenced by James Joyce's Ulysses. Some criticize its language. If you ever try to read James Joyce's Ulysses, or many works by James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, for example, it's very difficult to read because it's a stream of consciousness. And a lot of American writers took this particular work as, not necessarily copying it exactly, but using it as a very modernist style of writing because it's free-flowing, personal, autobiographical thoughts that are just put down on paper, regardless of, without considerable punctuation. Winsburg, Ohio is best known today for this collection of short stories or sketches of small town in America. It's a subjective, transparent, and experimental style of writing. Once again, we're looking at this subjectivism in the modernist era. Some of the influence, perhaps influenced by Gertrude Stein's sketches in Tender Buttons. Those are those two excerpts we looked at a few minutes ago. So his stories are loosely connected with repeated characters. He explores sexuality, thoughts, and morality. And as reminiscent from the naturalist era, his characters are inept and unable to work among themselves. In society, environment, no need for them, or it doesn't recognize their importance in general. So, a very depressing portrait of certain characters, but once again, a reflection of what the writer saw. The readers are caught in the dichotomy of pointing out the character's faults, but also recognizing part of the readers recognizing their own characteristics of themselves in the characters that are portrayed. So it's got that interest of appeal or recognition in that sense. And the presentation of these grotesque characters, and this word grotesque we'll see a number of times, but it's basically, pointing, describing people in lowly conditions and, poverty, certain, almost like almost naturalist in that sense, I guess. And it has a certain characteristic of this grotesque that's going to be repeated in a lot of writers. So here's an excerpt from Winsburg, Ohio. Hands upon a half-decayed veranda in a small frame house that stood near the edge of a ravine near the town of Winsburg, Ohio. A fat little old man walked nervously up and down across a big long field that had been seeded for clover, but that had produced only a dense crop of yellow mustard weeds. He could see the public highway along which a wagon filled with berry pickles returning from the fields, the berry pickers' youth and maidens' language. They laughed and shouted boisterously, etc. So you get the idea here of this fellow and how he's self-conscious and the way people look at him and stuff. The way it's written like that is not how the text is itself, but it just gives you an idea of, for a prose writer, how this sort of writing came about and is produced. The next person I want to look at here is Catherine Ann Porter. She wrote about Texas, where she lived for many years. Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and The Leaning Tower and other stories are some of the works that she produced. So here we have somebody writing about Texas. Notice the new region here. And here is a stamp that was laid out for her. Her novel in 1962, Ship of Fools, was popular at the time and it was made into a movie in 1965. She won the Pulitzer Prize for one of her works also, which is something to point out and perhaps remember. Many of her characters are women, so this is another writer about women. Remember, a lot of the writers at this time are not necessarily feminists, but they write about women and their experiences, which makes writers, for a particular audience or particularly pointing out a group of people that are less represented in other writers in previous times. So, it's the representation here, and a lot more women writers we'll be seeing, and a lot of their stuff that they write about will have to do with the either women or the feminist movement. So she had a relatively realist style, a lot of verisimilitude in the narrative depictions. Verisimilitude, likeness to truth, simple expressions but with deeper meaning, so kind of a portrait and get a more deeper significance from that there. And so this is the beginning of one of her narratives here, Jilting of Granny Weatherall. So get along, the doctor. And doctor, you sick, said Granny Weatherall. Leave a well woman alone. I'll call for you when I want you. Where were you 40 years ago when I pulled through milk leg and double pneumonia? You weren't even born. Don't let Cornelia lead you on, she shouted, because Dr. Henry appeared to float up to the ceiling and out. I pay my own bills, and I don't throw my money away on nonsense. So you have a text here that describes, a situation of a woman that's, staking her claim, having a voice. We can see some of the stuff that we've spoken about on that level. Our next writer here is Zora Neale Hurston, a very important figure of the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance was a group of writers, a group of African-American writers in coetaneous around the same time frame that wrote about the African-American experience, artistic movement in writing and in art that brought about a voice for African-American experience, for art and also for a voice in narrative and also as expression for different types of writing, as we've seen in some of the other writers already. So here's a picture of her. Nice photograph. She studied African-American Southern culture and integrated this into her style of writing. She wrote in dialect with colloquialisms. Here's an excerpt from chapter 1 of Mules and Men, which was published in 1935. It was night, and old Massa sent John, his favorite slave, down to the spring to get him a cool drink of water. He called John to him. John, what you want, Massa? John, I'm thirsty. I want a cool drink of water, and I want you to go down to the spring and dip me up a nice cool pitcher of water. So here we have, here you can see, the colloquialisms and in dialect. We've seen in other writers already, but some criticized her stereotyping of African Americans, as can be seen here, but she thought that African Americans should write for themselves and about their experiences regardless of this. And this is very interesting because we've seen this in other writers, in other African American writers that write a certain way because they want to appeal to a particular crowd, or they write in a particular, they'll write in dialect or colloquialisms because they want to, they believe that's more realist and true to life. So, criticism maybe from both sides, but like we saw with Du Bois, W. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, there's a couple of different ways that people have their ideas about how to express themselves and how people should go around to make change. So other works of hers that were important were Jonah's Gourd Vine. This brought her to the attention of other writers of the Harlem Renaissance. It's semi-autobiographical and something that I'd suggest you look into in more depth. But this title comes from Jonah from the Bible, and it discusses themes as marriage, politics, and the African American experience. So in the Harlem Writers, it's not just about the African American experience, although it is primarily what connects the writers, but obviously they're discussing many things that are connected to that, women's issues, social issues, apart from the African American experience, politics, obviously connected, but other types of writing as well, and you can see that in a lot of her work here. So she's mostly best known for her novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And once again, the language and voice are important in here. And as a African-American woman writer, we've got an overlap of important issues happening here, as we're going to see with other writers of the Harlem Renaissance, and we'll see these as we go along. I just wanted to point out one more thing. So these people are presented, all these different writers are presented in chronological order. I didn't put them all like Harlem Renaissance together, or I did by genre, not by particularly by groups of writers. Although some of them may be back to back because of the dates in which they were born. So in this particular work, the main character, Janie Crawford, grows up from being a young teenager into a mature woman with a greater understanding of the world as she confronts racism and sexism around her. Double issues here to look at as this novel is presented. So great writer and a great start to look at these different writers from the Harlem Renaissance.